Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome to our latest episode in the Secrets of the High Demand Coach podcast. And I'm here with yet another high demand coach, a dear friend, a fellow scale architect, Michael Vann. Michael is the president of the Vann Group. It's a strategic consulting and transactional advisory firm that works with owners and leadership teams of privately held small, mid-sized businesses. And he's also the co-author of Buying Out the Boss, which has to be one of the best book titles ever. But Buying Out the Boss, the successor's guide to succession planning, which has just fascinated me ever since I saw that you wrote the book. And he's, again, like I mentioned, a fellow scale architect from the Northeast. So we've got a Northerner here with us today, which will take me a little closer to my roots, and we'll have a good time. But Michael, thanks for being on the show. As we open up, why don't you tell us a little bit about your story? What were you doing before consulting, if anything, and what got you into it, and what's the why behind that for you?
So I have an interesting experience as a consultant in that it's what I've done my entire life. My first job out of college was essentially as a consultant for a Fortune 500 company, and just kind of got thrown into the mix first, kind of on the financial side, which I knew nothing about, and then started moving into more like the strategy side of it, and fell in love with that aspects of it. And so I literally have done nothing else as an adult other than serve as a consultant. So
That's
it's
awesome.
it's kind of a fascinating thing because usually, as you know, most coaches or consultants start, somewhere else doing something and then, transition into it. So I've been
Yeah,
fortunate. I've done it from day one.
fascinating. And so we got a little taste from your bio, but tell us a little bit about kind of the what. Like, what is it that you do for your clients? Where do you find yourself helping them the most?
It's interesting because our clients kind of come into three buckets. So we've got those that are working with on the growth side, so that's where we're utilizing predictable success a lot in helping those companies figure out, well, do we want to be in fun or do we want to scale into predictable success? And this usually dealing with those kind of whitewater pains.
Yeah.
That second bucket, though, is in that succession and transition planning spot, which is where we're working with owners to figure out, well, what am I going to do with this business? Is it going to transition internally? Are we going to look to position it sell internally? So, there's some commonalities with what we do in the growth side there. And then that third bucket is, well, those who are saying, just get me out of the business today, and so
Right.
we're handling the transaction. So, in that standpoint, we're doing all the things that you need to do to get the company to market and sold. So it really kind of is dependent on where in that overall, life cycle of, business ownership they are and what they're looking for. So we've been really lucky that we can kind of plug into each one of those key phases. And although we generally stay away from the startup stuff.
Right.
You know.
So you brought up an interesting point. I think that this isn't one that a lot of folks recognize, especially those who have had kind of a cursory introduction to predictable success, which most of our audience at least is aware of it. But one of the things you brought up is this decision between fun and predictable success, which seems like an obvious one at first, right? If you're
Yeah.
there stuck in whitewater, no one wants to be in whitewater. And so we want to get out. And the obvious choice is, well, why wouldn't we get out and go to predictable success, right? That's it's the name of the book, it's the top of the arc, it sounds wonderful. Everything about it is peaches and cream and rainbows and unicorns, right? But you and I know, working kind of down at the ground level with folks, that there's a very real decision that needs to be made between fun and predictable success. So, for the sake of the audience, why don't you describe a little bit about what that decision looks like and how you walk folks through it?
To me, it's all a question like how much pain do you want to want to go through, and where do you want to get your business to? If you're really looking like someday we want to build a lot of value here and have a great exit, then predictable success is the way you go. But if you're thinking, like, I don't want to kill myself over this business. I want to have a nice business that's going to provide a good income. Maybe there's an exit, maybe there's not. Then that fun stage is, where you start to transition back to. And so to me, it's really where does that owner want to get to?
Mm,
And as you know, we've got a lot of owners who start that journey to predictable success and then realize, what it's going to take to get there. This next piece isn't whether too much risk or too much effort. So they say, well, let's figure out how we work in the fun stage.
yeah.
So I think it depends on where the owner is in their mindset as to where you want to get to.
Right. And so you bring an interesting element to this that not many of our scale architects have done, especially not to the extent that you have, but kind of seeing the predictable success world and model through the lens of succession and succession planning. And so there's an interesting kind of addition to the whole idea of what stage do you want to be in, which is kind of what stage do you want to exit from.
Right.
And so I'd love to. So early struggle, can't, exiting from early struggle means it didn't work, right? So
Yeah, it's not good.
that happens a lot. And
Yeah.
again, we're making a little light of it, but it's a painful process, and I feel for anyone who experiences that. Um, but it's a relatively simple one to understand, right?
Yeah.
Now, from there, I almost feel like it gets exponentially more complicated once you've got some modicum of success. And so you move into fun. Tell us a little bit, I would say first and foremost, what does a successful exit in fun look like?
I mean, a successful exit in fun is kind of no different than the one in predictable success. It's really what changes is the multiples.
Okay.
I think by and large, because those ones who are in predictable success are inherently going to have just a larger scope to them than the fund company. So a lot of times the fund company, someone coming in to buy it is really looking at replacing the owner in that seat, rather than as more of an investment side of it that a strategic or a financial buyer might be looking at, unless it happens to be one. And I won't get into the nuances of platforms and add-on acquisitions, but there are those where it does get acquired by a financial, even though it's smaller, because it just plugs in. So I think for most people, an exit out of fund means you might be selling to an internal employee, or a group of employees. You might be selling to, someone local who wants to own another business and kind of step into your shoes. Whereas in predictable success exit, it's just a much larger and more complex exit.
Got it. So someone's there in fun. They've made peace with that. They're loving it. They're having fun, right? And they know, hey, this is where the sun's going to set on this business. Like someday I'm going to exit from fun. What are some things that they should be doing now in advance to make that process as successful as possible?
I mean, to a certain degree, it's no different than what you do in predictable success. Is can you get to the point where the business runs without you?
Hmm.
Where it's less reliant on what you need to do. And I think there's some limitations into fun as to, how far you can get into that perspective versus predictable success. But ultimately, if as a buyer, I don't have to worry about this business is going to fall apart because, Joe, the owner and founder has left. To me, that's the key. So do you have, typically a really good solid tier 2, management team in place, so we're handling the day to day for you. They're probably, into some tier 3 as well. I know we're getting into some of the terms here, but they're doing more so than thinking strategically about the business. And to me, that's one of the big differences.
And so just to interpret for a second, what you're talking about is the idea that we call tori, right? They're concentric rings, if you will, kind of like a Target logo. And in the very middle would be like a senior leadership team, right? Or an executive team, the C-suite of an organization. And they're primarily responsible for mission, vision, values, strategy, kind of long-term thinking, right? Yeah. And what you're saying in fun, have that or not have that. What's really important is that you have an effective T2, what we would call kind of a senior management group. Exactly. A group of folks who are tying that strategic to the tactical.
Yeah.
And getting that team set up. Now, I think that's actually a really, really big point because folks see big successful organizations and they think we need, a bunch of executives, right? That's how you lead an organization. Right. But what I hear you saying, particularly from a transition lens, it's not so much about having this kind of very strategic executive team. It's about having a solid T2. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, particularly in fun. When you're in predictable success and looking at those types of exits, I think the stronger your T1 team is, the better opportunities you have to exit. Some of the challenges when your T1 is really playing tier 2 and T3 roles all at the same time, someone's coming in and looking at that. So a lot of times a private equity will come in and buy one of our companies, and they're looking at those leadership and management teams. And if they're looking at, Oh, am I still there?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I just got this Zoom pop up that says I was logged out. Um, so like a private equity buyers, or they're looking at it, they're like, well, what do we have to bring in for teams? And like suddenly they're bringing in, well, we need to bring in a senior business development manager, a senior operations manager, a senior CFO, because that company didn't have it. Um, so I think that impacts value because someone's looking at they're impacting your EBITDA basically because they're going, great, we got to add a $200,000 a year CFO here because you don't have that currently.
Right. The other thing that you mentioned, and this is a little circular here, sorry for everybody, but one of the things that I wanted to make sure that everyone was familiar with, because this stunned me. Like I get it, it makes total sense once you hear it, but until I saw it, I like it. I never would have thought it. But so in fun, there's tend to be smaller organizations with smaller revenues, sometimes really great profit margins, sometimes not, right? Just kind of depends. But with a big factor that you brought up in between a fun versus a predictable success sale is this idea of a multiple, right? Which is typically going to be a multiple on earnings of some sort. So you've got a $3 million business, 33% margins. You're making $1 million a year in profit. Just be a great performing little organization. From there, you start looking at how much is this organization worth. You're looking at how many times that $1 million it's worth. Is that right?
Exactly.
And so somewhere in the fund stage, what would that multiple range be? I know it's going to be, industry and all kinds of factors, but a ballpark.
There's a lot that goes into that, but you might see in a 3.5 to 4.5 multiple range on a $1 million EBITDA company, depending on the industry and how that, the revenue it comes and all that stuff. But that's typical. When you start to increase those numbers.
Yeah, go ahead. So there's a big. This is awesome. Go.
When they exponentially get, the multiples get larger. So if you're at a $3 or $4 million EBITDA, and now you're talking a 5 or a 6 multiple. The scale of the transaction, even that one turn, is huge. The difference between a 4 and a 5 on $5 million is
right.
$5 million. It's
and just to play that out, right? So our $1 million of profit becomes a $3.5 to $4.5 million acquisition or transaction in fun.
Yeah.
Now you fast forward, you do the heavy lifting, and it's not easy, but you do the heavy lifting of getting through Whitewater, getting deep into predictable success. Organization's growing because it's scaling. So now, you've got a $3 million profit at the end of the year. So it's like, okay, great. That's what, 12 and a half, 13, $14 million transaction. That sounds great. But now what you're talking about is that's not all of it, right? Not only are we going from more profit, which means a higher transaction, but we're also looking at a higher multiple on that profit. Exactly. And so it's a significant dynamic gain in predictable success.
Yeah, the multiplier just changes drastically because that EBITDA is going higher, so that every turn on that EBITDA or on that multiple, it just increases it substantially.
Yeah. So let's move to Whitewater, because it's kind of where we're going to be making the decision one way or another. What do you see folks doing around this Whitewater stage in terms of selling or not selling, or is this where you would say some of your get me out of here now folks are coming in?
Absolutely, because they're looking at it going like, we can't take this any further, and a lot of times we can't go backwards. Because the business has hit such a critical mass, the overhead, whatever it may be, is now like, we can't go backwards, and we're not prepared to go forward. So let's get out. Yeah. So it's pretty common to see that. I've had owners say, I've taken as far as I can go. It's now up to somebody else to do it.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of our sellers who are not at a retirement age come into play.
Got it. Because Whitewater is just miserable, right? Anyone who's there now, they know this. Anyone who's been there knows it. Anyone who's not been there doesn't think that the thing exists, right? Which is part of what makes it so miserable. So you've got this owner, they've just been rocking it out in fun, at least for years now. It's up and to the right, things are going great. And then they wake up one day, they hate the company they work for, right? Exactly. They would have quit a long time ago if it was that simple. They're tired of, fussing with people fighting. They're tired of firefighting. They're just tired, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, they've got what you brought up is this idea of it feels existential, right? I can't take this any further, right?
Yeah.
I've reached my max as far as I can go. And now they're kind of back into a corner, right? And so I would
Right.
imagine, from a succession planning standpoint, Whitewater isn't exactly where you want to be making a transition. Is that right?
In an ideal situation, no, because that's where that's where a lot of the warts get found in the due diligence process, and like we've got one right now that's going on, and the company has realistically doubled in size in the past couple of years, and the structure of the organization hasn't kept up with it. So some of the basic things that you could do when you're a $2-3 million $4 million company, you can't do as a $12 million company. So those things are all catching up. And of course, someone coming in who's doing due diligence, and you're looking at a $12-15 million company, and a purchase price along those lines is going, well, you don't have this, you don't have that, you didn't do this right, and God, you get beat to death in due diligence, and it's frustrating and painful.
Yeah. And again, I want to kind of fast forward because we've talked about predictable success a little bit, but I want to fast forward because there's a lot of similarities I've seen, at least from a distance, between selling out of Whitewater and selling out of Treadmill. In a sense that clock becomes much more to do with like the internal clock of the person trying to sell than it does what's the opportune time for a market or
Right.
for our life cycle stage. So if we were to fast forward to Treadmill, right, we see lots of founder exits in particular around the Treadmill stage.
Yeah.
Why is that, and is that beneficial?
Is it beneficial? I mean, it is, because the organization is consistent at that point, and good, better, and different, so it means the EBITDA is probably pretty stable. Sales is pretty stable. We've got our teams in place. So from a buyer's perspective, going great. There's not a lot of surprises that are waiting for me. And now I'm looking at it as like, okay, what can I do with this organization to get it to that next level, basically back into a predictable success where it's growing again and has a lot of opportunity. So that's one of the advantages of selling in Treadmill. It's very consistent. You don't have to worry about a lot of the due diligence things that pop up.
Yeah.
You just may not have the hockey stick of growth and EBITDA growth that might acquire a higher multiple. But depending on the size and where it's at, it could very well, because it's stable.
Right. And so, if we were to kind of boil this down, what I hear from you is best time to sell is going to be predictable success, both in terms of just transaction value because of multiple earnings, all of that. Maybe second best time is going to be somewhere around Treadmill, just because you've kind of fought the fight. You've got a large organization. If you're willing to make that sacrifice to get through Whitewater and get into predictable success and really drive it.
Exactly.
And if you're not, then settle into fun, build a strong management team, have fun, enjoy it, and then when the time comes, you're ready to go.
Exactly.
Nailed it. Excellent. Well, that is sound advice. It sounds simple and it sounds almost a little trite in a podcast from 1,000 miles away, but the reality of it is, as business owners, one of the things that I've seen is that our vision rarely exceeds our time with the organization. And it's when you start talking about succession that you come face to face with that. And so I think a discussion like this is just massively helpful. There's steps that anyone can take now. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But before we get there, especially in the context of all that we've talked about, one of the things I've been dying to hear, and I know our folks have as well, is you've been doing this for a long time. And you've been doing it in this succession space where the rubber really does meet the road. And so I'd love to hear from you. What's the biggest secret that you wish wasn't a secret, right? What's the one thing that you'd want to share with everyone listening today?
It's kind of, if we're Patriot fans up here, and
oh my goodness.
And, so there's a lot of drama right now over who's actually the offensive coordinator. And they played the other night, and Belichick kept saying, well, we've got a process that we're going through. We've got a process we're going through. And I says, to me, the key advice is trust the process. Whether we're starting with predictable success and the growth, or we're dealing with succession planning or merger and acquisition, there is a process that you follow, and the process works. So trust it. It's if you can do that and buy into it, well, then you're going to see the results. Our clients who fail are the ones who don't trust the process.
Mm.
Time and time again, they get weary about it. They fall off. They just don't do they don't have the disciplines to do it. And that's what happens.
Yeah. And I think that's fascinating because when you look at who your clients are, many of them, these very entrepreneurial, kind of founder type, visionary type, they thrive on just destroying processes left and right.
Absolutely.
But when it comes time, and this is, again, such a powerful point that you're making, there is a place for process. And it may not have been in what brought you success leading up to this point. But when it comes to either getting out of whitewater or it comes to working through a detailed transaction, right, there is process that comes into play. And when you bring someone along like the Vann Group, someone who's like, this is what we do all day, every day. You're absolutely right. What's funny is just how viscerally difficult that is for, those visionary types. But if you can do it, it's a temporary woe for a much longer satisfaction, if you will.
No doubt. Well, I think some of the challenges, because it's such a big change, as when you start to go through these processes from the way they've operated, and now it's like, all right, well, you're gonna delegate more. You're gonna allow your team to make mistakes. You're gonna, like we was talking to one client the other day. They were involved in discussion as to where the snack machine was going in the company. When it was getting moved. Like, what are you doing? It's just not. It's not at your level of the organization. But they've grown up that way with the business and being involved in all those decisions. So for us, when that CEO and owner can make those decisions, like, you know what, I'm not going to get involved in this. I'm going to trust the process. I'm going to be cognizant of those things. Is when the magic and excitement happens.
Yeah,
that transformation.
That's excellent. Which no visionary would ever say, right? Like, the magic and excitement happens as the result of a process. Get it? Just like it's a complete world breaker. But it's so true. Again, especially in this context, and recognizing that and like, there's a time for kind of breaking things, but there's also a time for aligning with things. And I think you're very right too.
I think one of the fascinating parts about it too is like when you have that visionary CEO and you're talking to them about these things, it's like you're going to be successful by being less involved, less engaged in a lot of these things. And they're, they kind of get the cocked head and the turn scratcher, like, no, because it's run so counter to what they do and what they think. They built this. Yeah. And now I'm telling them, no, step back. Matter of fact, I don't want you in all these meetings. I don't want you. I'll bring you in occasionally. So
it's so true. There's so much wisdom in that. We don't have time for it, but it's fantastic. So I've worked with enough coaches to know that we have a knack for spending all of our time, best time, energy, and resource on our clients and helping them and helping achieve their goals, that we can lose sight of our own. So I'd love for you to take your kind of consultant advisor hat off for a moment, put your president of Vann Group hat on, and talk to us a little bit about what growth looks like for you and your business.
So we've made the fundamental decision to be in the fun stage. Like, I did what I think a lot of CEOs and owners do, and is like, all right, I'm going to build this big consulting group, and we're going to start to add and move services and things like that. And I made the decision after struggling with it in my own, own kind of stages with it, and said, forget it. We're gonna scale down. It's going to be me. It's going to be outsourced resources. And just focus on working with the companies that we like to work with. And so that's been really kind of the growth strategy, has been to take on the stuff that we like, because it generates great income when you do that. When you're in demand for that stuff, rather than trying to sell more people.
Yeah. And that's a hard decision to make, right? So being on this side of it, what would you say to someone who's sitting there trying to make that decision today?
As to whether to grow or not?
Yeah, is it okay to go? It feels like it's going backwards, right? So is it okay to go backwards for your business?
It is, because if it's what you want and it's going to make you happy, I had a great client who illustrated it for me a few years ago, and she had and still does, a really successful recruiting firm. And she realized right before the pandemic actually started, she said, I'm just chasing growth because that's what everybody says I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to build this with big organization. She was part of EO and these types of things. And it was like, well, that's just stupid. It's about collecting things rather than what I really, really want. So, she's been really intentional with the business today as to how she's running it, the size it is. She was able to go back into fun while we were coming out of Whitewater and just really nail the business to what she wants. And I think she's really happy with the decision because from a lifestyle standpoint and from an income standpoint, it works.
Yeah.
She's not spending a lot of money on managers and, throwing everything back into the company. So she gets to harvest it and, have her time to do what she wants to do. So it was like one of those eye-opening moments, oh, yeah, it is okay to do it. It doesn't have to be bigger just to be bigger.
Very, very good advice. Not what everyone is expecting to hear coming into this, but immensely sound advice. All right, last question for you here. I know some of our listeners would love help. They're either have been thinking about succession or they realized they haven't been thinking about succession, or like me, they heard the title of the book, How to Buy Out Your Boss, and be like, okay, I've got to know more about that. How can folks connect with you?
Well, you can find us on our webpage. Certainly www.vann-group.com. And up there we've got, some great videos as to talking about our process in how we work, which I think is, really critical to understand because we're not selling something per se. We're, talking about our philosophy. And then you can also catch me, on email. The easiest one is just letsgo@vann-group.com. I don't have much of a social media presence. So.
Awesome.
Sure.
So again, that's www.vann-group.com. So 2 N's in that, vann-group.com, or let's go at vann-group.com. Michael, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. And for everybody else listening, we say it all the time, but we mean it every time. Your time and attention are the biggest honor that we could receive. And so we thank you for spending time with us today and look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.